Hello, everyone, and welcome to the worship and Bible study time of the First Baptist Church of Baldwin Park, California. So happy that you are joining with us today. We've spent the last 2 months going verse by verse through the third chapter of Paul's letter to the church at Ephesus, Ephesians. Today we conclude that study. Our key verse today is verse 20, but to give context to this verse, let's read the section where the verse is found. That's verses 14 through 21. We've been reading that section each week for the past few weeks. So let's read it together one more time. Ephesians chapter 3, we're going to read verses 14 through 21. And our key verse today is verse 20. Remember, this is a prayer. And Paul writes, "For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasses all knowledge, that you may be filled up with all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly, beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus, to all generations, forever and ever. Amen." In 1961, an Anglican bishop by the name of J.B. Phillips wrote a book entitled "Your God is Too Small." Now, of course, he wasn't saying that God is small. He's saying that as Christians, our understanding of God is too small, too limiting. That in our thoughts and in our prayers, we reduce God to caricatures like, a kindly policeman or a benevolent Santa Claus or the man upstairs, instead of seeing God and understanding God and all of his power and glory. I think the Apostle Paul would have liked that book. Almost 2,000 years before J.B. Phillips wrote the book, Paul was trying to say the same thing in the letter of Ephesians. He was reminding us as Christians that there is no limit to the power of God, that the power of God is unimaginable. And Paul wants to remind us of that. So let's look a little more in depth at our key verse for today, verse 20. The verse begins with the words, "Now unto him who is able." Of course, he's talking about God there. Unto him who is able. Well, able to do what? Anything. Everything. There is no limit to what God can do. The Bible is, what we're thinking of the Bible, it's a catalog of all the marvelous, miraculous works of God. He sent down manna from heaven on a daily basis to feed an entire nation. He parted the waters of the Red Sea when the only thing that stood between his people and freedom was that sea. He closed the mouths of lions when a wicked king threw one of his prophets, Daniel, into the lion's den. He was with the 3 Hebrew children when they were thrown into a fiery furnace, and he protected them. And the Bible tells us that when they came out, that they didn't even smell like smoke. I love that little touch that the Bible adds there. He helped a young shepherd boy named David, the future king of Israel, to defeat an evil giant named Goliath when that giant had the entire army of Israel quaking in their boots. And he took a man named Saul of Tarsus, the man who wrote this letter of Ephesians. We know him as the Apostle Paul. He took Saul of Tarsus, whose heart was so filled with hatred for Jesus and his church that he devoted his life to eradicating it. But God changed his heart and sent him out into the world to preach the gospel. And he became the greatest missionary the church has ever known. Ask yourself, is there anything that God can't do? You know, we read in the Old Testament on multiple occasions about God telling the army of Israel before they would go out to fight a battle, he would tell them to celebrate the victory before they had even fought the battle. Now, the first time you read that, when you're reading through the Old Testament, I know in my case, the first thing I thought of was that old saying, you know, that old proverb about don't count your chickens before they hatch. But you see, they were going to win the battle because God was on their side. God already knew the outcome. The victory was won even before the battle was fought. Now, this spiritual principle in the Old Testament is seen fully in the New Testament, primarily in the cross and the resurrection. The cross looked like defeat. The resurrection was the victory. And so remember that in your life as a Christian on this earth, you are fighting battles that have already been won through the power of Christ. What is impossible for you and me is not impossible with God. All things are possible with God. And so that's the first thing that Paul tells us in this verse, that God is able. But look at what he says next in verse 20. He is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we think or ask. Have you ever tried to explain something to someone and you just didn't have the words to do it? Now, I find as I'm getting older that happens to me increasingly. You know, you kind of forget a word. You can't remember what it is you're trying to explain. But that wasn't Paul's problem. It wasn't old age creeping up on Paul. Paul was trying to explain something that cannot be fully explained, and that's the power of God. There are no words that are adequate to explain it, but he tries. And so what he does is he makes up a word. Now, depending upon the translation that you're reading from, and all of them translate this made-up word differently, or it's really a compound word. Paul put two words together to make up a new word to describe God's power. All the translations translate it differently. I read a little while ago with you from the New American Standard translation, and it translates Paul's word as far more abundantly. The King James translation says exceeding abundantly. The New Living Translation says immeasurably more. The New International Version says infinitely more. Now, if we were to pull out our Greek New Testaments right now and to look at it, we'd see that Paul took two words and put them together to make a new word. One of the words that Paul chose means above and beyond. The other word means abundant. And so Paul put them together in trying to describe the infinite power of God, and he says it is abundantly above and beyond. You know how we say of someone that they went above and beyond the call of duty? We mean that they did more than was expected of them, more than was asked of them. That's what Paul is saying here about God. That God goes above and beyond what we ask, what we expect. He can do more even than we can imagine. See, God's plans are bigger than ours. What God desires for your life is bigger than what you desire for it. And his power is greater than we can imagine. So Paul is saying to us here, let go of your worries and start trusting God. I read about a missionary who was writing a letter to his supporters to thank them for being his prayer warriors. But he made a typo in the letter, and instead of thanking them for being his prayer warriors, he thanked them for being his prayer worriers. That's a pretty good description of a lot of Christians, prayer worriers. Their prayers are little more than a list of all the things they're worried about, all the things they're afraid of, all the things that they're fretting over. Paul wants us to move beyond our worries, to place our trust in the infinite power of God. Now look at what he says next. We're still in verse 20. That's our key verse for today. He said that God is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we think or ask. Look what comes next. According to the power that works within us. Now, we've seen this word power before, just recently here in chapter 3. And you'll remember that we get our English word dynamite from this. This is the word that Alfred Nobel chose to describe his new explosive. Dynamite, he called it. But the Greek word dunamis, it doesn't mean explosive power. It just means power that can overcome any obstacle, power that overcomes all resistance. Paul is saying that that power, which is inherent in God, it's God's power. Look at what Paul says. It is at work within us. That phrase, by the way, at work within us, Paul adds another word there, very similar to the word power, but with a different meaning. But it's important for us to see this too. That word work, at work within us, we get our English word energy from that word. And if I could show it to you right now through this video, written out in Greek, the Greek letters, transcribed into English, it looks almost exactly like the English word energy. It would be energia. And it means power that never stops working. Think of the Energizer Bunny. You remember those commercials? The bunny, because he has those batteries in him. He never stops moving. He's always on the go. That's what Paul is saying here, that God's energetic power is at work in us. It never stops. When you go to sleep at night, you're facing some obstacle, some difficulty. There's a great challenge in your life, and you go to sleep at night and you're not even thinking about it. You're no longer worrying about it. God's energetic power is still at work. Now, some power is dormant. In other words, it's there, it exists, but it's not always in use. A battery would be a perfect example of that. You can take out a battery that you bought a year ago. And so long as you haven't been using it, if you pull it out and put it into a flashlight or, whatever you're going to use it in, it will do what it's supposed to do because the power has been dormant all of that time. But Paul says that God's energy is not dormant, it is active. It is always at work, and his unlimited power, which can overcome all obstacles, Paul is saying it is already at work in you. There is a spiritual principle that is seen throughout the Bible, and it is that God always gives more than enough. Do you think the power of God is more? Do you think it's enough for your problems? I know your power isn't, my power isn't, but do you think the power of God is enough? Paul would say it's more than enough. And we see it throughout the Bible. God always gives more than enough. There's a story in Matthew 9 of a man who comes to Jesus and asks Jesus to heal him. And Jesus not only heals him, he forgives him of his sins. God always gives more than enough. There's the story repeated in all four Gospels. In Mark chapter 6, for example, it's the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. 5,000 hungry people. Jesus takes one little boy's lunch, a little bit of bread, a little bit of fish, and he uses it to feed 5,000 hungry people. And not only that, After everyone had finished eating, there were enough leftovers to fill up 12 baskets with the leftover food. God always gives more than enough. There's the great parable that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 15 about a young man whose life was centered around selfishness and greed. He goes to his father and tells him that he wants his inheritance money so he can leave and go out and live on his own, and he does. Finally, after being away for a while and hitting rock bottom, he comes to his senses. And he comes back home, realizing the breach that exists between them now, at least in his mind. He says to his dad, I'm not worthy to be your son anymore. Would you just hire me on as one of the hired hands here on your land? But instead, the father brings out an expensive robe and puts it on his son, whose clothes were probably in tatters by then. And he takes an expensive ring, probably a family heirloom, and he puts it on his son's finger. And he kills the prized calf so that they can have a feast and celebrate because his lost son has come back home. That's what God is like. He always gives more than enough. But look, there's something else here, one other spiritual principle at work. God not only always gives more than enough, he always gives better than we ask for. That's what Paul means when he says that God can give far more abundantly above and beyond all that we ask or think. It's a comfort to know as we pray and just as we live that God is able to do far more for us than we can think or ask or even imagine. Now, this verse isn't saying that God is going to give us everything we ask for. What a disaster that would be. In our lack of wisdom and our lack of foresight into the future, our lack of knowledge about the future, we ask for things at times that would actually be to our detriment. So this verse isn't saying that whatever you ask for, God is going to give it to you. God doesn't always give us exactly what we ask for. However, we can be sure that because he can do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, that if he doesn't give us what we ask for, it's because he wants to give us something better. Some of you are old enough to remember back when people used to order things out of catalogs. Now, today we just order everything on the internet through Amazon, but some of you remember back in the day when, paper catalogs would come to your house, like the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And people would look through them and, order things that they needed. I remember reading about one man, he lived way out in the country, so he ordered all of his clothing through the catalog that came to him. Now, you might remember that in the catalogs, there'd be an actual paper order form. There's no internet back then, so if you found something, the pants on page 183, whatever, something that you wanted to buy, you had to take the number, and write it down on this piece of paper, and you put your name and your address and all of that, the size, you filled it all out. Now, at the bottom of those forms that you would mail in to the company to tell them what you wanted, at the bottom of that form, there was a question. And the question was, if we do not have the article that you ordered in stock, may we substitute? Now, this man said that he would always put in big, bold letters, no. He did not trust this company to pick out something different from what he ordered and send it to him. So he always wrote no. But after a while, he started thinking, well, maybe I should take a chance. It probably after a few times of the company not having what he ordered, the exact thing. And so finally he wrote down kind of in small letters, down at the bottom, may we substitute if we don't have the article that you ordered. He wrote, yes, real small letters, yes. And when the article finally came in the mail, it came with this explanation from the company. It said, "We are sorry that we do not have the article in stock which you ordered, and so we are sending you something better at our expense." And he said after that, every time when he would order something from the catalog, and down at the bottom, that question, if we don't have in stock what you ordered, can we substitute something else? He would always put in big bold letters, yes, because he trusted that company now that they would send him something. If they didn't have what he wanted, they'd send him something even better. I think that's what Paul is trying to tell us here. Not just about our prayers, but about the way that we live. We ought to tell God that we are willing for him to substitute his will for ours, and take what we ask for, the specifics of it, and set it aside if it's not in our best interest. And instead let him answer our prayers and guide our lives according to his perfect will. You see, that's the spiritual principle here. God may not always give you exactly what you ask for, but he will always give you what you need. And so we can be sure that when we place our faith in him, as the Apostle Paul said to us, that God will give us far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think. It's been a joy to share with you for these last 2 months in this magnificent 3rd chapter of the letter of Ephesians. I hope that it has been a blessing and an encouragement to you. I know it has been to me as I've studied through it again. Look forward to being with you again next Sunday. Until then, may God bless and keep you.